Well, welcome to another edition of The Mind of Christ. It's one of the longest series I believe I've ever done, and if it ever gets completed, it will definitely be the longest series I've ever done because the Mind of Christ study I call Challenger Deep based upon the deepest part of the ocean. I figured the Mind of Christ was pretty deep, and I needed a pretty big name for it for the study that I'm doing. But I began the study in 2010. It took me till 2017 to complete the study and producing 21 journals and a lot of ink and a lot of insight into the mind of Christ. And I'm trying to share some of this with you. We're in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Actually, we're not in the middle of it. We're at the very beginning of it. And it's the very long section. And of course, it'll take a very long period of time to complete a study of the Sermon on the Mount. We're trying to do an in-depth study. This is not your average Sunday school class. This is more of an in-depth study of Scripture and trying to learn how we can understand Christ better so that we can imitate Him, so that we can think like He does, and that our lives will conform more to His image. So thank you for joining us. Again, our study is in Matthew chapter 5. There is some references in the book of Luke, and I'll tell you when those come into play. In this particular one we're going to talk about today is another beatitude, one of the blessed passages, and is found in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 9, where it says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Now this word peacemaker is really a combination of two words. It means to be peaceable, and then the word to make. So it is to make something or someone peaceable. It's the only time in the New Testament this is found is in this particular verse. So we don't have anything to compare it to per se as far as the use of the word. However, the word peace is found very often in Scripture, and we will look at some references that help us to understand the idea of peace a little bit better. Also, the concept of reconciliation is a part of this. That would be a synonym in this case to peace. And also the idea of harmonizing or bringing something into harmony. So this equates with what we've talked about in quite a long time ago, homeostasis, which is the balance or the stability needed to live well in this world. Perhaps I need to see, but perhaps I need to see this more than simply resolving conflicts. In other words, peacemakers, we often think about, okay, as someone who helps resolve a conflict, but perhaps we need to see it in a little broader perspective. Could a peacemaker be one who brings stability into a person's life by bringing them into harmony with God and with others? So being a peacemaker may be more than just managing a conflict. It may be just simply bringing people into harmony with God and one another. I suppose it is all connected, and we'll see how this is connected as we get into it. How can one love God whom he has not seen when he does not love his brother whom he has seen? If we cannot be in harmony with our brother, how can we be in harmony with God? And I believe it works a little bit the other direction too. If we're not in harmony with God, how can we be in harmony with other folks? When I studied the word peace, it's eirene in the Greek, there were three categories of understandings of this word. Now, I'll tell you before I tell you what they are, that they are very closely associated with each other, and I'm not sure that there's a lot of difference among the three, but I'm going to give you the three anyway so that you can see maybe a little bit of the distinction that's made. So the word peace, it could particularly be in a civil sense. In other words, not at war. We're in a state of peace, not at war. The verb, which is the verb ero, means to join. And this is part of the word eirene, where we get the word for peace. So part of the word for peace comes from an original word to join together. So prosperity meaning one, or peace, or quiet, or rest. It means without dissension, something that's going on where there is no dissension involved. The second category of understanding peace is by implication a state of peace or tranquility. So if there is not a conflict going on, then we're in a state of peace and tranquility. And number three, peace meaning health, welfare, prosperity, every kind of good. And so it's more of a personal peace that's in my life where I say, I'm at peace. I'm at peace with the world. I'm at peace with God. I'm at peace with you. And so there's a general health and welfare, and it's just another way of saying all is good. So all of these seem to be so close as not to make much distinction, but the proof of the distinctions will come as we look in the scripture, and we'll see how this word is used in various places. The first place I want to direct your attention to is Luke chapter 14 and verse 32, where it is mentioned of a king who is outnumbered in battle, so he sends a delegation and he asks for terms of peace. Peace here is a negotiated peace. The terms have to be worked out, if you will. So often people do not want to stay at the table and work things out. We have to have terms of peace. These terms must be verbalized. So if there's a contention between two parties, in this case of Luke 14, it's between two opposing armies. If one sees that he cannot win the war, then he will ask for terms of peace. So you sit down and you negotiate terms of peace. And that is a metaphor I want you to think about letting it stick in your mind, so we may come back to that in a little bit. In Acts chapter 12 and verse 20, there's a story there about Herod, who was angry at some people in Tyre and Sidon, and they had been being fed by Herod. In other words, he was giving them some relief. And it says, so with one accord, they came asking for peace. In both cases, peace was where there was a weaker party looking for peace with a stronger party. It was in the best interest of the weak party to find peace with the stronger party. Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 34, where he says, I did not come to bring peace on earth, but a sword. So how is it that the Prince of Peace, Isaiah chapter 9, who teaches peacemaking, how is it that he would bring a sword into many relationships if you read the entire context here? Well, the natural outcome of the exclusive claims of Jesus is that those who do not accept these claims will be estranged from him and also estranged from those who do accept the claims of Jesus. The rift will often be deep and will be perhaps even physically dangerous. So Satan is at war, and according to Revelation chapter 12, with the rest of Christ's offspring. So here we find that there are natural tensions even in a peaceful kingdom, the peaceable kingdom of God. There are enemies of that kingdom, and when we cannot have peace with them, then there will be a sword, there will be conflict. There's a parallel passage in Luke chapter 12 and verse 51 where it says division rather than a sword. So Jesus came to bring division and not just a sword. So Jesus's intention is not division, but his natural claims of deity and messiahship will separate men because people will fall into two classes, those who accept that is the truth and those who will reject it. So we are either for or against him. So this business of being a peacemaker must be considered very, very carefully. It certainly could lead us to a very wrong conclusion about what peacemaking actually looks like. Peace must be always compatible with truth, or else it is not real peace, even if there is an absence of rancor. So you may have two people who are in conflict with each other. They decide just to ignore the conflict. They don't address the issues in the conflict. they may seem to be at peace with one another, but really the root cause of the conflict remains, and it hasn't really been worked out. In Acts chapter 7, verses 20 through 30, is a wonderful illustration. In this case, this is Stephen is preaching this sermon, and he brings up the case of Moses, who on his return to Egypt killed an Egyptian for mistreating an Israelite. He then noticed two Israelites who were fighting, and he intervened as a peacemaker between them to try to reconcile them with one another. Well, they resisted by pointing out that Moses had killed an Egyptian. So they were having trouble being reconciled by someone who was a murderer. So was Moses a peacemaker? He was a murderer. He had no he had no ability to reconcile the Israelites, slaves, to this Egyptian taskmaster. So in one sense, he brought a sword by killing the taskmaster, but Moses expected unity between these brothers. His previous violence was used as an excuse for the brothers not to listen to him. So was Moses justified in killing the Egyptian? Well, perhaps. Verse 25 is the key to this. It says that Moses made the supposition that his brothers understood that God was granting their deliverance through him, but they did not really understand. In other words, Moses was trying to be a peacemaker with the Israelite brothers who were fighting with each other, but they knew that previously he had killed this taskmaster, and he thought that they would see him as a deliverer, but they didn't see him that way. They didn't understand that he was trying to deliver Israel from the Egyptians, and so they didn't listen to him. So was he a peacemaker or not? Well, effectively speaking, it did not result in peacemaking. The peacemaker may not be received if the person does not understand the role that God has placed the person in. So when do we get involved in a dispute? And when do we just let others work it out? That is an interesting question. Romans chapter 14 and verse 19, we are told to pursue the things that make for peace and the building up of one another. But in Romans 12 and verse 18, Paul recognized that this was not always possible. He says on that occasion, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. So we're to pursue peace, but yet we may not be able to have peace with all men. In Hebrews 7 and verse 2, it tells of a man named Melchizedek, a prince like Jesus, or a priest like Jesus, who was a king of Salem, or a king of peace, because the word Salem means peace. The intent and pursuit is always to reconcile and to bring peace, but to do it around truth, the truth that Jesus is our peace. Now, according to Ephesians chapter 2, only Jesus can make the two one, Jew and Gentile. That he is the one who can tear down the wall of hostility, thus making peace. Peacemaking is not agreeing with one another, but rather agreeing with God. Now, this objective peace, no longer being at war with God, is a prerequisite to genuine and lasting peace of mind and peace between men. That's a very important point. If we're going to be truly peacemakers, the best thing we can do is to help bring people into harmony and peace with God. Because if two people are at peace with God, they're more likely to find peace with one another. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 1, it speaks of this kind of peace with God through faith in Jesus Christ. In Romans 15 and verse 13 says that God fills us with this peace. He is the one who reconciles all to himself. This peace of God is beyond our comprehension and understanding. This is a peace that will guard our hearts, according to Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, I believe it is, or 6 through 8. Simeon, the old man at the temple when Jesus was just a baby, prayed for the ability to depart this life, to die, in other words, to die in peace. We often, you remember, when someone dies, we often say, rest in peace. Well, he wanted the ability to depart this life in peace. Luke chapter 2:29. So this may be no more than a sense of tranquility in his case. In Luke chapter 11 and verse 21, the word undisturbed is used to describe the strong man's possession. In other words, his possessions are undisturbed. They're at peace. So when things are in their proper place and they are undisturbed, or they are at peace, getting the parts of our lives arranged in their proper place is another way of looking at the idea of peace. Jesus contrasts peace with tribulation in John chapter 16 and verse 33. In Jesus, there is peace, but in the world, there is tribulation. Since Jesus has overcome the world, we can have courage that our peace is secure in him. So after a period of persecution, the church enjoyed, it says, a time of peace, being built up, going on in the fear of the Lord and the comfort of the Spirit, which led to the growth of the kingdom. The God of peace is, or as contrasted with confusion, was leading Corinth to peace in the midst of division, according to 1 Corinthians 14 and 33. The word is also used in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 3, and is also found in the Old Testament. There is a false sense of peace that some people have, and they may have this peace, and then sudden destruction comes upon them. In the Jeremiah's day, people would run around saying, peace, peace, and there was no peace. There was only the prospect of the Babylonians coming and taking them off into captivity. Zechariah prays for the light to shine the way of peace. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 79, this is where that's found, Zechariah being the father of John the Baptist. Jesus is called the sunrise in John chapter 1, in Luke chapter 1 and verse 78, who shines into the darkness. And you find that concept as well in John chapter 1. So there seems to be this correlation that if you're going to have peace, there needs to be some light. There needs to be something that lights the way of peace. Because often if you can't see where you're going, then there's all kinds of opportunity for confusion and misdirection and accidents and things that would not cause peace. So where the shadow of death exists, where that prospect of death exists, there is little peace in our lives. In Luke chapter 2 and verse 14, the angels announcing the birth of Jesus proclaimed peace on earth among men with whom he is pleased. And so those that God is pleased with also enjoy a time of peace. When Jesus sent out the 70 on that limited commission, according to Luke chapter 10, verses 5 through 7, he instructed them to give the common greeting, peace or shalom, as a way of determining if the man of the house was a man of peace, in order for them to know whether or not this was a receptive house. He says, if you find someone that way, let your peace rest upon him. But if you don't find peace, or if it doesn't return to you, if the person does not say shalom back to you and wish you to have peace, then you are to let your peace return to you. Being a man of peace and connecting with others who are men of peace is important and a major indicator of how we do evangelism. Reception is a part of evangelism, and peace is one of the indicators. In Luke chapter 19 and 42, as Jesus weeps over the city of Jerusalem, who had not received his peace when he visited them, in other words, he brought shalom to them, but they did not return his peace. It says that Jesus says, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. In other words, I brought you peace. I brought you the way of peace, and you did not recognize it. You did not return the greeting of peace to me, and therefore they have been hidden from your eyes. Jesus was their peace, but they did not welcome him into their home, just as they did not welcome the prophets who had gone before him. And so war was coming. Those who do not receive the peace of God will get the judgment of God. And why? Because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. You did not recognize that Jesus came and knocked on your door and offered you peace, and you did not return that peace to him. And so the only thing left was judgment. In Romans 8 and verse 6, Paul teaches that the mind set on the Spirit is life and peace. And in Romans 8 verse 7, he explains that the mind set on the flesh is hostile to God and does not subject itself to the law of God, for it is not even able to do so. There are many ways that our minds can be set on the flesh, but when it is set on the flesh, there is no real peace within our souls. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 15, part of the armor of God is having one's feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. The good news of peace is fundamental to the gospel, because without the gospel, we would all be at war with God. We would be enemies of God, and it's a war that we cannot win. But instead of us sending to him to make terms of peace, he sends an envoy to us to make terms, lest we be destroyed. Remember the passage that we talked about in Luke chapter 14 about the terms of peace. It is not the weak one that is going to the strong one and asking for terms of peace. It is the strong one, in this case God, who comes to earth and offers man, the weak ones, terms of peace. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 16, God is called the God of peace, who grants peace to all in every circumstance. He is the ultimate peacemaker. Every situation in life requires peace and a certain kind of peace. As we follow God, we learn how to bring this designer peace, if you will, to all circumstances of life. So see Romans chapter 15, verse 33. By the way, both here have his presence as a part of the peace component. In Romans chapter 16 and verse 20, the God of peace is the one who will soon crush Satan under the feet of the Roman Christians. This sounds like a function of peace is war. In other words, in order to have peace, the enemy has to be crushed. Spiritual war. For peace to reign, the enemy must be defeated. In Philippians 4 and verse 9, Paul teaches that we learn, we receive, we hear, we see in this life when we put into what we put into practice, and that will contribute to the God of peace being with us. So obedience is also a key to having peace. 1 Thessalonians 5:23, it is the God of peace who sanctifies us entirely. When a part of life is unconquered for holiness, there is no peace. There is no internal, there is an internal conflict which is produced by guilt. So when we are not being led to be holy, we're not at peace because there's internal conflict caused by guilt. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 20, it is the God of peace who raised from the dead the great shepherd of the sheep. So the greeting of peace, shalom, is a mechanism that we use to approach the world to gauge their receptivity. We offer peace to see if peace will be returned. Someone who looks for a fight is unable to receive peace. Unless the non-Christian believes he is outnumbered by God, he will not seek terms of peace. He will think he can win by his fine-sounding arguments and by his feeling of superiority, but he will find out that he cannot win in this conflict with God. So he needs to accept God's peace into his life. In John 14, verse 27, Jesus conferred his peace on his apostles, not as the world does. So how does the world give peace? Perhaps much of the world's peace is superficial, is shallow, is unattainable, is built on a shaky foundation. Perhaps it gives people a false sense of hope and security, because peace peace that they sense within themselves really rests on things that have no power to actually bring peace into people's lives or to sustain that peace in their lives. World peace is fundamentally different than the peace that Jesus gives. Now, we said a lot of things. We covered a lot of scripture here, and I want to break this down into 10 categories. So here are some of the key concepts that we have fleshed out thus far, and I want to summarize them and then make some and each of them will help us to understand what a peacemaker really is. So the first one is a peacemaker brings stability or homeostasis into a life. So if you're going to be a peacemaker, you have to see that, first of all, you want to have peace in your own life, but you want to be able, in the lives of other people around you, you don't want to make their lives worse. You don't want to stir them up. You don't want to confuse them. You don't want to bring something into their life that's going to cause them a lack of peace. And so a peacemaker will always be trying to bring stability into other people's life. Now, we know people who are just troublemakers. It seems like all they want to do is just stir up trouble in our lives. Well, we're to be the opposite of that. Secondly, a peacemaker promotes reconciliation between estranged parties. First of all, with God. We are ambassadors of reconciliation. We try to bring people into reconciliation with God. Thirdly, a peacemaker has to work out terms of peace. God is the ultimate peacemaker, and he did this through his Son. So the terms of peace that we work out in the lives of people who are in conflict with each other should mirror the terms of peace that Jesus brought to us by the cross. Fourthly, a peacemaker's outcome may be a sword. In other words, in order to get to the peace, we may have to bring a sword or more conflict when necessary terms of peace are rejected. In other words, if I'm trying to establish peace with someone, there may need to be a little stormy period in order to get to the peace. That's one of the reasons people avoid conflict, is because they don't want to go through the stormy period to get to the real peace. And so, but sometimes you've got to do that in order to have peace with another individual. Fifthly, a peacemaker's peace must conform to truth, or it is no peace at all. So peace has to be real. It has to be genuine. It can't be just simply, oh, just forget it. Let's don't talk about it. People who just kind of smooth things over, but they don't really get down to the issue, are people who are not living in the truth of the matter. The next one is a peacemaker will be ineffective when others do not accept his role as a peacemaker. If you have things in your life that you prove that you are not a man of peace, you're not a person of peace, then often people will not listen to you. They will not respect you enough to let you help them work out the issues that you have. And so it's probably a person who has conflict at home and is not living in peace with his wife is probably not going to make a really great marriage counselor for those who are having trouble in their marriage. So a peacemaker always pursues peace, but recognizes that he cannot always attain peace because it does not all depend on the peacemaker. In other words, we have to understand a peacemaker is not responsible for all the outcomes. He simply makes the effort. He does the best he can, but it doesn't all depend on the peacemaker. The next one is a peacemaker seeks to bring the parties into agreement with God and not simply with one another. If our goal is simply to get two people to agree, then you will not have a very long-lasting peace normally. But if you can get them to agree with God, then the peace can last much longer. And then again, the resulting state is to be undisturbed. In other words, what we are trying to accomplish is to live a life that is undisturbed. And then relative peace must exist between people for the gospel to be heard and accepted. If the people of God are not getting along with each other, if they're not living in peace and harmony with each other, how can we share the gospel of peace with a world that is in conflict? And so it behooves us as Christians to learn not to live in division and not to live in contention and dissension with one another. And then finally, the battle for peace is the battle between flesh and spirit. Flesh and spirit. That's fundamentally what's at stake here in this question of peacemakers. There's always going to be an element, if there's conflict, there's always going to be an element of the flesh that is warring against the spirit. Now, the tenfold outline that I just gave you is the framework for understanding the role of a peacemaker. So if you want to be a peacemaker, I would encourage you to listen to these 10 conclusions based on the scriptures that we looked at, and you will learn what it means to be a peacemaker. Each component is essential to the process. And I believe that my view of peacemaking has been too short-sighted in the past, that I did not include all of the components necessary for peace to exist. And so I learned something as I was doing this study, that I was short-sighted in the way I define a peacemaker. Perhaps the greatest truth is that when two people are at peace with God, they will be at peace with one another. This is true in math and geometry. Two lines equal to a third line are equal to another. But practically, what does this look like, and how is it applied in conflicts between religions, between married couples, parents and children, nations, church members? In all these situations, what does that look like? To be able to bring about true peace, some essential common ground must be reached to build a house of peace. Now, what is the connection with the outcome? Because it says, if you're a peacemaker, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. This one is different from others in that the peacemaker receives a designation of being a son of God. The word called here from kaleo, it seems to me this is not a mere invitation, but more as a designation. In Hebrews 5 and verse 4, in talking of the priesthood, Aaron did not take the honor upon himself. He was taken from among men and appointed. He was able to identify with men because he had the same frailties. And no one takes this honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God even as Aaron was. But then look at the application. In Hebrews chapter 5, verse 5, Jesus did not glorify himself, but God said to him, "Thou art my son, today I have begotten you," or thee. He goes on to explain that the Son learned obedience through what was suffered. The one called by God is called Son. So God calls people, but he calls them by a name, or calls them by a designation, and he calls them Son. The invitation precedes the designation. So one is called first, but then once they are called and they accept the invitation, then they are called sons. So, just as happened with the apostles, they were called and then they were given the designation as apostles. So this reminds me of the parable of the landowner in Matthew 21:33 and following. He sent his slaves to get the profits, but each one was rejected and killed. So he decided to send his son, saying they will respect him, but he too was killed. The one designated to bring peace was killed. The connection of peacemakers and sons seems to be the idea of likeness. God promotes peace by coming near and revealing himself and opening his heart and emptying himself, all of which was done through Jesus. Do you get that? How did God establish peace? He came in the form of a son. He came near, he revealed himself, he opened his heart, he emptied himself, all of which brought about our peace. In this way, Jesus connected or identified with God's other children, son to son, brother to brother. The older son draws the younger children to the Father, and thereby closer to one another. Brothers are expected to be at peace because they share a common heritage. We know this is not always the case, but it is the natural course. It is the natural course. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 and following, as an example, the estranged relationship of the Gentiles to God is described in verse 12, and to the Jews in verse 11. They were separated, they were excluded, they were strangers, there was no hope, there was no God. But Jesus himself became their peace. Peace is a person, not a negotiating strategy. Understand that. Peace is a person, for he himself is our peace. He brought us near by his blood and abolished the law in his flesh, the elements of the communion, the body and the blood of Christ. His goal was to make the two one new man, thus establishing peace. He was about reconciling both Jew and Gentile in one body to God through the cross. He also preached peace to those who were near and those who were far away. Through this means, access by one Spirit is given to the one Father. The condition of verses 11 and 12 is reversed in verses 19 through 22. The key to peace among all men is to accept the work of Christ as their operating system, the operating system of their lives, not negotiating a creed or accepting a list of preconditions. Allegiance to the Son brings peace, making us sons and co-heirs with Christ. When we proclaim Christ as our peace, we identify with the Son who is peace. Romans 8 speaks of the spiritual conflict which rages inside the hearts of men, flesh and spirit. The mind of the Spirit is life and peace, he says. The mind set on the flesh is hostile to God. The state of being hostile to God is not being pleasing to God. So our mandate is to be led by the Spirit out of this cursed conflict into peace and life. But those thus led are who, according to Romans 8:14? They are sons of God. This is a transition from slavery and fear to a spirit of adoption as sons, which leads to the Abba cry. The Spirit confirms our status as children of God and fellow heirs with Christ. Sonship is meant to be a place of belonging, of freedom, and of peace. The connection between peacemaking and sonship is clear. It is the conclusion of the war. It is sitting around the table after the cannons have ceased and the dangers have passed to celebrate with the Father. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And they will sit at his table, and they will enjoy everlasting, eternal peace with the Father. So, learn what it means to be a peacemaker. Peacemaker has so many implications. Learn those 10 ideas that inform us about what peacemaking really is. And then apply them in every situation in life, especially beginning with our relationship with God and then letting it inform our relationship with one another. Well, thank you for joining for this study. This is we're slowly going through the Sermon on the Mount, and appreciate your spending time with us again today, and look forward to seeing you back here again next week. God bless. Peace, perfect peace.